Now back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
And welcome back to The Law Show on CL 650. Today we're talking about immigration law. Gordon Maynard and Alex Stojkovic join me here from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver. And we're talking about the border on this go-round. And we mentioned earlier that TV show that I love watching, Border Security. And they have it at the airport, at the border. It started in Vancouver, I think, and now they have it at all the other borders across the country. They shoot this show. And it's a Vancouver-based film company that does it. But what I kind of get from watching that show is if you go to the border and you're kind of upfront and honest, they seem to deal with you, or maybe they portrayed it that way on the TV show, that there seem kind of a bit common. Is there some common sense there? Is that what you take from the show? You know, we talked about the enforcement issues before the break, but from watching the show, it just seems if you tell them the story and you're honest, you have a much better shot at the border.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a lot of weight put against you if they catch you in misrepresentation. They put a high priority on it. So they like credibility. They like people who are forthright. And if you're forthright with them, if you tell them the truth why you're there and what you're trying to do, if they can help you, they will. And that's good for them. It's good for them. If they can't help you, they'll tell you. But being forthright is good. Being caught in dishonesty with them is not going to help your case.
Now you mentioned that they're bringing back these senior officers, right? So who were they retired or were they moved into a different department? Can you explain what that means?
It happens across the board. It's not just CBSA, but in immigration as well. There are fluctuations in demand of personal needs in the department, and there's only so many people to go around. And so sometimes they offer contracts out to legacy officers to come back. Lend a hand under contract. And it's good. I like it when it happens. It's needed. It's needed in order to break through backlogs.
No, I travel an awful lot, and I come through the airport, and I see the people that are working there. No disrespect to them, but they're young. They're really young. Like I see a lot of these kids look like they're in their 20s, and they're, you know, it's a good career, right? You've got a government job, you've got a full pension, I'm sure, and you know, you get paid pretty well, and you've probably got not bad hours. You work at the airport, can't be that bad. So, but they look like they're a bit wet behind the ears, some of them.
Well, the challenge, though, is, as I mentioned earlier, the turnover is still high at the port of entry. Because the thing is, the ones that are good at this job eventually can move their way up. The agency's huge.
So they can move up quickly.
And they move up quickly. The ones that are not good at it tend to burn out. And the reason is because, you know, there's no real... you can't be prepared as a child of our education system, I would argue, for people to lie to you on a constant basis. I mean, this is not an easy job. We sit here criticizing Canada Border Services officers all the time, but the reality is you're being asked to manage a multiplicity of statutes and to be at least aware of them. So this is back to your Ray Davies thin line, you know, Kink song back there. It is a thin line in a sense. You're expected to know a lot about various different things. You're supposed to assess someone quickly because the other part of the border that's critical is that you have to move things along. So their training is designed on making a decision in 30 to 40 seconds as to whether or not, and this is in primary, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, whether or not to send someone to secondary. And that's both in a customs context and in a immigration context.
Because they're under huge pressure, especially at the land border with massive hour-long waits for people to come across the border to keep things moving along. I mean, at an airport, they know the flow based on the number of flights coming into the country, but we've all been at a border crossing on a long weekend, and that's no fun. And there's a huge amount of pressure for individuals and commerce to get across the border both ways.
So it is difficult to balance these things. Running in a shift, you're supposed to try to determine who needs what and under what sort of context, who's telling you the truth, who's not telling you the truth. And the challenges that poses, and where the border often gets into difficulty and when officers get into trouble, is that you have to profile people to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And the profiling is where they often run into difficulty later in terms of judicial oversight, because inevitably there's more scrutiny of some people rather than others. The beauty of the Nexus scheme and other frequent traveler schemes is that you move yourself out of
the
regular pool, and you move yourself into a pool that's been pre-screened, if you will. So there are some significant challenges to being an officer, and I think that's what results in the big burnout rate for officers at the port of entry generally.
It seems to me that the border is a bit of a no man's land. Now, you talk about all of these different jurisdictions that they have under their tent, but they seem to be able to do things that maybe a regular police officer wouldn't once you had passed the border.
That's right.
So what are they allowed and not allowed to do?
Gordon's going to tell you that you don't have the right to remain silent, right, Gordon?
Gordon, you can't stay silent on this. You have to speak to the matter.
There's a lot of rights that we take for granted that just don't quite exist the same way at the border.
Now, with a regular police officer is allowed to ask you your name, your address, and some basic information about who you are.
What an officer is not allowed to do on the street is to detain you without reasonable grounds.
Or search your possession.
Or search you unreasonably.
Mm-hmm.
They got to have reasonable grounds to believe. There's got to be certain circumstances present before they're allowed to do that. And that's a charter protection. It's enshrined. There's provisions in our charter against unreasonable search and seizure. There's provisions in our charter against detention.
So when you go 100 meters inside the border, an RCMP officer pulls you over. Those are the things that officer is allowed to do. How is it different?
No, a CBSA officer, when you go to the border...
Zach said 100 meters after.
After 100 meters after the border, RCMP pulls you over. They're allowed to do
certain things in certain
circumstances.
Right.
At the border, how is it different?
Well, the threshold is entirely different. There's been cases on this, cases like the Degani case and numerous cases regarding seizure and detention at the border, search, seizure, and detention. And the bottom line is that when people travel to a border, they don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy. They know that when they come to a border and they're carrying luggage, both their purpose in entering Canada and what they're bringing into Canada is subject to examination. That's the purpose of the border. The job of CBSA at the border is pretty straightforward. Is to determine whether or not you have a right to enter Canada, and if you don't have a right to enter Canada, whether or not they should authorize you to enter Canada, and for what purposes. That's their job. That's the role of the examination at the port of entry. And our law says that everybody who goes to the border must be examined. So whether you know it or not, when you and I or anybody goes to the border, you're making an application for entry. And the border is going to examine you on that application.
And is it different whether you're a citizen or not?
A citizen has a right of entry, but you have to satisfy an officer that in fact you are a citizen. A permanent resident has a right of entry, and you have to satisfy an officer that you are a permanent resident. An Indian under the Indian Act has a right of entry. Everybody else does not. They may or may not be authorized to enter. Now, at the border, you may be detained, except it's not a detention. It's not a detention for charter purposes.
And charter means the law of the land.
Charter of rights and freedoms.
Right.
Yeah, the charter says that when you're detained, you have a right to be notified of your right to counsel, and you have a right to make reasonable efforts to locate counsel and consult them. You're supposed to be told this, and you're supposed to be given that opportunity. But that doesn't happen at the border because detention at the border is not a detention for the purposes of the charter.
What is it?
It's an examination to determine whether you have a right of entry, but it's not a detention for charter purposes.
So I guess the way they work around it is you're not really in the country yet. You're just asking to come in.
You're not really detained yet.
And the way our statutes work are really, those of us that are Canadian citizens, we don't have any automatic right to enter wherever we like. We still are subject to examination and inspection and proving to the satisfaction of those officers that we are Canadian citizens. So if we move into the rights of entry that Gordon just mentioned, Canadian citizens have a right to enter. Our stuff, however, doesn't necessarily have a right to enter.
Not those 5 bottles of wine in your suitcase.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of foreign nationals and permanent residents, there's different rules than applicable to Canadian citizens. Their stuff may or may not have a right to enter, and they may or may not have a right to enter.
I'll qualify that. We have arguments about this. A permanent resident has a right of entry.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. In my view, this is something that's a touchy area. It's a matter that is being reconsidered behind the scenes right now.
Yeah. There's a belief in the department that permanent residents don't have a right of entry, that they have a qualified right of entry subject to their ability to prove that they meet the residency obligation. We, however, in the Canadian Bar Association, I think I speak for both my colleague Gordon here and myself,
and for the entire bar.
And for the entire bar, says no. They have an absolute right to enter
because they've met that that level already.
If they can prove, and I think I'm going to illustrate an example to describe all of this. When you arrive at the border, the first thing that you're being faced with is the primary inspection line, which officers often refer to as the pill line, right, Gord? Yeah. So when you're in the primary inspection line, the role of that first officer is to, through questioning you, determine your residence, your citizenship, and what you're the purpose of your entry to Canada. So if you provide, for example, your Canadian passport or your citizenship certificate or some other document that suggests that you're a Canadian citizen, you have passed primary inspection for the purposes of
right of entry.
Right of entry. You may be sent to secondary for customs purposes, to review your purchases, to look at what you've declared, to review your customs declaration card that you filled in before you arrived. Or perhaps if there's monetary issues with the amount of money that you're carrying, or something else to do with your declaration. If you're a foreign national, you may be sent to immigration secondary. That's a different type of secondary. That's a secondary that just deals with immigration issues.
So one is for stuff, the other one is for people.
Right.
Yep.
And the one that's relating to people, exactly right. The one that relates to people may look into whether or not you say you're a permanent resident, but let's say you don't have documentation to prove that. They may send you to secondary.
Well, the other one I always see on the TV show, the Border Security TV show, is they do a secondary for someone who's coming to visit their girlfriend, but they're really here to work.
Exactly.
And that's not
that kind of issue.
Now that's a foreign national who does not have a right of entry.
Right.
So that person would be sent to immigration secondary. So you essentially have these two secondaries you can be sent to. The issue with permanent residents, and where we and the agency have had some challenges, if you will, is that once they've established that you're a permanent resident, the bar's position, and I think the law says, you are to be allowed into the country. What actually happens, though, is in many instances where people are suspected of violating their residency obligation, case that I have right now, for example, they are put in a room, told that they have to fill in a questionnaire, often threatened that they can have their status taken away from them, and they fill in this questionnaire, complete all of this information, and lo and behold, they've now admitted that they don't meet the residency obligation, and they get a removal order. Our position in the bar is that those questions are voluntary, and the officers, once it's established that you are a permanent resident, you're not compelled to answer any further.
But you mentioned earlier that Gordon said, you said to Gordon that you have to answer questions. That's one of the differences at the border.
Section 16 of the Act says that you have an obligation to answer all questions honestly that are put to you for the purpose of the examination. And even CBSA.
That's pretty broad.
No, it's not. It's specific. It's for the purpose of the examination. You have to remember what's the purpose of your examination at the port of entry. It's to determine whether or not you have a right of entry.
Right, okay.
And a permanent resident has a right of entry under the Act as long as they're a permanent resident. So once you've established that, that's the end of that examination. You've met that criteria. You're no longer compelled to answer questions about any possible ground of quote, inadmissibility that might give them a right to report you. You have met the threshold of what you're required to do.
But they don't know that. You know that.
You don't know that.
Challenge.
That's the challenge.
And the difficulty that we run into is that officers are aware that there's disagreement as to what the legalities of this are, and they basically ignore them and trap people in these kinds
so
of
statements. I'm guessing someone comes in and they've gone through this and they've answered more questions than they're legally obliged to do, and then you get a call.
Yep.
Because
right.
I'm now going to be thrown out of the country. Or the threat that you could be thrown out.
Luckily, permanent residents have a right to an appeal in this situation.
But there's the threat there, and that's when they're worried. They're like, well, I've got a home, and I've got children, and I've got everything here.
Right.
And now I've opened up my mouth, and I'm put myself in jeopardy. And that's when you get the call.
Right. And by that time, the horses are already out of the barn. Mm-hmm. I'm dealing with a case now where, according to what I understand to be the circumstances, the permanent resident was asked questions that they weren't obliged to answer, was told that we're going to give you a removal order and you have to leave Canada. This is nonsense. They're a permanent resident. They have a right of entry. It was correct to give them a removal order if you have that information, but they still had a right of entry and they had a right of appeal. There was no obligation for them to be turned around at the border and leave Canada. So we're seeing circumstances arise that really put into question whether the conduct of the border is in compliance with the rights under the Act.
With that, we'll take a quick break and we'll continue our conversation about immigration law on The Law Show on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.